Stop scrolling. Right now, ask yourself this question. When was the last time a toxic person shattered your confidence, invaded your peace, and made you doubt your own worth? Was it the boss who pretended to be your mentor while quietly sabotaging you behind closed doors? The friend who always made you feel like you owed them something? Or the partner who wrapped cruelty inside flattery so you'd never leave? If you're honest, you already know this truth. Manipulation isn't rare. It's everywhere. And if you've ever wondered why these people keep showing up in your life, you're not alone. This isn't just random bad luck. It's a design. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal Robert Greene's most dangerous discovery about the dynamics of manipulation, power plays, and toxic personality patterns. Insights pulled straight from the 48 Laws of Power, the book that's been called the playbook of the 1%. Let me introduce you to Victor. He's 31. He's smart, ambitious, and he thought he was immune to mind games. But when Victor started a new job, he met a co-worker whose friendly facade slowly turned into a labyrinth of guilt trips, lies, and silent threats. Victor didn't see the trap until it was almost too late. And neither will you, unless you learn to recognize the 5 toxic people Robert Greene warns you to watch out for. What I'm about to show you will change how you see human nature forever. Because the truth is, most people spend their entire lives underestimating how far some will go to secure power over you. Stay until the end, because I'll reveal Robert Greene's most dangerous insight about human nature. An insight so unsettling, it's been banned, criticized, and feared by those who prefer you remain naive. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to spot and avoid the 5 toxic people Robert Greene warns you about, so you'll never attract them into your life again. If you think you're safe because you're a good person, think again. Because in the next few moments, I'll show you why your kindness is exactly what they prey on. Ready? Let's start with the first toxic archetype. Victor's first day at the agency should have been the start of something exciting. New clients, new colleagues, a fresh chance to prove himself. Instead, it felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone else already knew their lines, and he was handed a script he'd never seen. It started subtly. A senior manager named Thomas singled Victor out. He smiled too easily, asked personal questions with a warm curiosity, and nodded like he'd already decided they were friends. At first, it was flattering. Victor thought he'd been accepted instantly. He didn't see the trap tightening around him. Robert Greene observed that most people believe enemies are obvious, he wrote in the 48 Laws of Power. But the most dangerous adversaries present themselves as allies. That first week, Thomas went out of his way to help. He offered to show Victor how to format proposals, which clients to be cautious with, and which supervisors were impossible to please. Every tip sounded like mentorship, but each suggestion carried a tiny, invisible cost. If Victor followed Thomas's advice, he alienated other colleagues without realizing it. If he ignored it, he risked seeming ungrateful. The real test came during a quarterly strategy meeting. Victor had worked late every night preparing a pitch that he knew could impress the directors. But when his moment came, Thomas casually interrupted. "Oh, Victor has some interesting ideas, but he's still getting up to speed," Thomas said, with a laugh that sounded harmless to everyone else. In that moment, Victor felt something slip away. His credibility, his momentum, his sense that he was in control. This is where so many of us fall into the same trap. The false assumption everyone makes is this: if someone is friendly, they must be safe. If someone offers guidance, it must be for your benefit. If someone takes an interest in your life, it's because they care. But Robert Greene understood something most people can't bear to accept. The friendliest person in the room may be the one most invested in your failure, because it gives them leverage you won't see coming. Victor didn't want to believe it. He replayed Thomas's words over and over, trying to convince himself he'd misunderstood. He told himself he was overthinking, being paranoid, too sensitive. But late that night, alone in his apartment, he realized the truth. He had been disarmed by charm, and in that moment of vulnerability, he had handed over his power. But here's where it gets dangerous. Once you allow a toxic person to define your reality, you start to believe their version of you. And from there, it's a short walk to surrendering everything that makes you strong. Victor tried to shake off the humiliation of that meeting. He told himself it was just one bad moment. Everyone slips up. Maybe he was being too sensitive. Maybe Thomas really did mean well. But as the days passed, the pattern only got clearer. Every time Victor began to regain his confidence, Thomas would find a way to undermine him, sometimes with a joke, sometimes with a perfectly timed question that made Victor look unprepared. The strangest part was that no one else seemed to notice. To the rest of the team, Thomas was a supportive leader. They called him the office mentor, and new hires were always told to learn from him. That's when Victor began to suspect the problem wasn't just Thomas. It was something bigger, something hidden in plain sight. Robert Greene's most controversial insight was this, he wrote in the 48 Laws of Power. The person who teaches you the rules is often the one who benefits most from your obedience. Victor couldn't stop thinking about that line, because when he looked back at every piece of advice Thomas had given him, he realized none of it had truly helped him grow. It had only made him more dependent. Whenever he had a question, Thomas was there. Whenever he needed reassurance, Thomas provided it. And whenever he tried to assert his independence, Thomas reminded him, gently, always gently, that he wasn't quite ready. It was mentorship, but with invisible strings. Victor started to see that what he thought was generosity was really a strategy. By positioning himself as the gatekeeper to success, Thomas ensured that no one ever challenged his authority. The uncomfortable reality is this. Most people desperately want a guide, someone to show them how things work, someone to validate them, and that desperation makes us blind to the cost of accepting help without questioning the motives behind it. Victor noticed the cost in his own behavior. He stopped sharing ideas in meetings unless Thomas approved them first. He started checking his emails twice before replying, worried he'd make a mistake that Thomas could later use as proof that he wasn't ready. Bit by bit, his sense of agency eroded. He watched himself become exactly the person Thomas described, hesitant, unsure, dependent. This wasn't an accident. It was a design. Robert Greene understood it better than anyone. The mentor who flatters you into compliance will eventually own you. Victor realized he was no longer just being managed. He was being shaped, molded into something predictable, controllable, safe. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He began to wonder how many other people in his life had done the same thing in smaller ways. How many times he'd traded his instincts for someone else's approval. But here's where it gets dangerous. When you rely on someone else to tell you who you are, you never really know yourself. And that ignorance is the most exploitable weakness of all. Victor spent the next week observing everything with new eyes. The office he once thought of as a normal workplace now looked like a stage where every person was cast in a role they didn't even realize they were playing. The more he watched, the clearer the hidden choreography became. Junior staff deferred to Thomas, even when they knew he was wrong. Managers praised his mentorship, ignoring the fact that every project Thomas touched seemed to revolve around him, And the executives, too detached to see the daily dynamics, believed he was the backbone of the entire operation. Victor saw it all, and he started to feel the cold shock of understanding. This wasn't chaos. This was a system. In the 48 Laws of Power, Robert Greene explained, that control is most effective when it feels like freedom. It struck Victor so hard he had to step outside and catch his breath, because that single sentence explained everything. Thomas didn't control people by barking orders or issuing threats. He controlled them by offering choices that were rigged from the start. It looked like freedom, but it was really a carefully curated illusion. When Thomas offered to help, it gave people the feeling they were in control of their own growth. When he offered friendly feedback, it made people feel safe. And when he occasionally withheld his approval, it triggered a craving for validation so powerful that everyone fell in line without realizing it. The psychological mechanism was as elegant as it was sinister. First, create dependence. Offer guidance that sounds indispensable. Second, mix praise with doubt, so people question their instincts. Third, withdraw approval at key moments, so they chase it harder. Fourth, position yourself as the only path to success, so no one ever leaves. Victor remembered something Robert Greene wrote about in the 48 Laws of Power. The ultimate power is the ability to make people come to you. If you can seduce them into believing that you hold the keys to their future, they will surrender more willingly than if you force them. And that's exactly what Thomas had done. Every time Victor thought he was making an independent choice, what projects to pursue, whom to collaborate with, how to present ideas, he was really acting inside a narrow script that Thomas had designed. And the scariest part? Everyone else was too busy seeking Thomas's approval to notice the strings. Once you see the theater, you can't pretend it's real anymore. Victor realized he wasn't just fighting for professional respect. He was fighting to reclaim his perception of reality. He began to wonder how often this same performance played out in families, friendships, and even romantic relationships. How often do we call it love, mentorship, or loyalty, when it's really about control? But here's where it gets dangerous. The moment you recognize the theater of control, you face a choice. Keep playing your part, or risk everything to walk off the stage. Victor sat alone in the corner booth of a dim cafe, staring down into a cup of coffee he didn't remember ordering. For the first time since he'd started at the agency, he couldn't pretend he didn't know what was happening. He was caught in it, the invisible system he'd thought he was immune to. He replayed every moment in his head, the subtle glances when he questioned Thomas, the way colleagues would go quiet when he offered a different perspective, the fact that every time he tried to pull back, he felt a familiar tug of guilt, like he owed Thomas something for all his help. Robert Greene warned that the most effective form of control is the one that makes the victim complicit. Victor had always assumed that control looked like coercion, raised voices, overt threats, blatant sabotage. But now he understood how much more dangerous it was when control looked like cooperation. Because once you believe you're choosing it yourself, you stop questioning it at all. That realization made Victor feel something he hadn't felt since he was a teenager: shame. He wondered how he'd let himself be reduced to this, waiting for permission to think for himself, watching his own ambition shrink to avoid upsetting the person he'd been taught to trust. But as he looked around the cafe, at the young woman typing furiously on her laptop while glancing nervously at her phone, the middle-aged man rehearsing an apology under his breath, he realized he wasn't alone. This is how people get stuck in patterns. First, they mistake manipulation for mentorship. Then, they confuse dependence for loyalty. Finally, they start believing that without the manipulator's approval, They'll fail. Victor felt sick as he recognized the same stages in himself. He'd stopped pitching ideas without Thomas's blessing. He'd stopped reaching out to other teams because Thomas hinted they couldn't be trusted. He'd even begun to doubt whether he'd ever deserved the job in the first place. That was the final trap. When someone controls your perception of yourself, they don't need to control anything else. It was so subtle, so gradual, that by the time Victor realized he was in a cage, he'd already thrown away the key. Robert Greene warned that the longer you stay in these patterns, the harder they are to break. Because every small concession becomes part of your identity. Every tiny surrender reinforces the story that you are less capable than you really are. And every day you stay silent teaches you that silence is safer than resistance. Victor wondered if there was any way back, if it was possible to recover the version of himself who believed in his own instincts, or whether the damage was already done. But here's where it gets dangerous. The moment you wake up to your own complicity is the moment you realize how many other parts of your life you've surrendered without a fight. Victor didn't sleep much that night. It felt like his mind was a locked room where every memory replayed on a loop, every moment he'd swallowed his ideas, every time he'd laughed off an insult, every instance he'd chosen silence because it felt safer than speaking up. When dawn finally broke, he realized he couldn't keep living like this. He knew the risk. He could lose Thomas's favor, maybe even his job. But he also knew that staying was a different kind of loss, the kind that devours you from the inside. He spent the morning poring over the notes he'd scribbled in the margins of the 48 Laws of Power, searching for a strategy that felt true to who he was. Robert Greene's solution was radical, he wrote. Withdraw the fuel of your attention. Deny the manipulator the reaction they crave, and you starve their power. It sounded simple, almost too simple. But as Victor read the passage again, he understood why it was so effective. Thomas's influence depended entirely on Victor's belief that Thomas had the right to define his worth. The moment Victor stopped accepting that premise, the entire structure would start to collapse. The path forward was difficult and terrifying. Detach emotionally. No more confiding. No more seeking approval. No more letting Thomas's moods dictate his own. First, set visible boundaries, politely but firmly declining help he hadn't asked for. Second, reclaim visibility, sharing his work directly with managers and peers instead of filtering it through Thomas's narrative. And third, accept discomfort. Because breaking free would mean being misunderstood, criticized, maybe even punished. Victor rehearsed what he'd say the next time Thomas tried to undermine him. He practiced phrases like, "Thanks, but I have it covered. I'll take responsibility for this one. I prefer to present my ideas directly." Each sentence felt like an act of rebellion. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew Thomas would escalate, would try new tactics to reel him back in. But Victor also knew this was the only way out, because if he waited for permission to free himself, he'd be waiting forever. The necessary path, Robert Greene wrote, requires you to risk the very approval you've been conditioned to crave, and that's why so few people ever take it. Victor closed the book and took a deep breath. He realized that he was about to become someone he'd never been before, someone who trusted his own judgment more than the approval of others. But here's where it gets dangerous. When you finally reclaim your autonomy, you discover how many people benefited from your silence, and they won't let it go without a fight. Victor felt like he was walking into battle. The morning he finally put everything he'd learned into practice, his hands were trembling so badly he had to hide them in his pockets. But as soon as he stepped into the office, something shifted. He was done pretending. The first test came before 9 a.m. Thomas strolled up to his desk, that familiar practice smile on his face. "Victor, I was thinking you should let me look over your quarterly report before you send it up. You know, just to make sure it doesn't raise any red flags." A month ago, Victor would have nodded, grateful for the guidance. Today, he looked Thomas straight in the eye. "Thanks, but I'll be sending it directly to the directors," he said evenly. He watched Thomas's smile flicker, then reappear. "Oh, sure. If you think that's best," Thomas replied, voice tight. Victor felt a rush of adrenaline. He hadn't expected it to feel so clean, so simple. Robert Greene believed that those who reclaim their independence become dangerous to manipulators, he wrote in the 48 Laws of Power, because they can no longer be steered by flattery or fear. Over the next few days, Victor continued to apply what he'd learned. When Thomas tried to pull him into gossip, Victor excused himself. When Thomas offered unsolicited advice, Victor thanked him politely and moved on. When Thomas attempted to question his decisions in meetings, Victor calmly restated his position without apology. It was as if he'd stepped out of a fog. For the first time in months, he could see the patterns clearly, the subtle manipulations that had once seemed so natural he'd never thought to question them. He also began to notice how Thomas reacted to this newfound clarity. The charm turned brittle. The help became condescension. And when none of it worked, Thomas's mask slipped just enough for Victor to glimpse the resentment underneath. But Victor wasn't afraid anymore. He understood now that Thomas's power had never been real power. It had only ever been the power Victor surrendered to him. And once he stopped surrendering, there was nothing left for Thomas to hold over him. That was the true liberation. Because when you finally see manipulation for what it is, it loses its hold over you. And the people who once controlled you become ordinary, even small. Victor wasn't naive about what might happen next. He knew there would be consequences, whispers behind closed doors, small acts of retaliation, maybe even attempts to discredit him. But he also knew something more important. He would never again mistake someone else's agenda for his own truth. He was free, not because he'd beaten Thomas, but because he'd reclaimed the most powerful thing of all, his perception. Victor never became the office favorite again, and he didn't care. He didn't need the polite nods or the thin praise, because the moment he stopped craving validation, he started attracting something he never expected: respect. People began to notice that he didn't flinch when Thomas spoke, that he defended his ideas without apology, that he set boundaries others were too afraid to set. Victor had become the kind of person who could no longer be quietly controlled. And that transformation didn't just change his career. It changed the way he saw every relationship in his life. He stopped tolerating the friends who only called when they needed something. He stopped excusing the family members who used guilt as a weapon. He stopped letting his own doubt make decisions for him. Victor finally understood what Robert Greene meant when he wrote that power is never given, it's taken. Now you have the same dangerous knowledge. You've seen how the most toxic people disguise themselves as mentors, how they weave dependence out of your own insecurities, and how they feed on the belief that you need their approval to feel worthy. You don't. And the moment you decide to reclaim your autonomy, they lose their grip on your mind forever. If this video opened your eyes, don't leave without subscribing. Because every week, I share strategies that will make you 1% better, braver, and more impossible to manipulate. Hit subscribe now and join the community of people who refuse to live in the shadows of someone else's agenda.